In this episode of CARPe Diem.
There are about 2 million pensioners in Canada who are at risk of losing part of their pension. Is their government doing enough to protect you?
CARPe Diem, seizing the day for Canadians as we age.
Welcome. In today's episode, we're going to hear from our experts about pension protection in Canada. First, let's go to Leah Bolden and meet this week's Zippy Zoomer.
My heart belongs to Daddy. He treats me so well.
We are back with our latest and greatest Zippy Zoomer. She's 61 years old and she is a performer. Let me introduce Salve.
But if I do, I don't follow through, 'cause my heart belongs to Daddy.
My name is actually Salvacion. When my mom was giving birth to me, we both nearly died, and we were saved from death. So my paternal grandmother named me Salvacion, salvation in English. And everyone calls me Salve. I'm one of 6 children, 4 girls, and all my sisters perform professionally.
Someday.
I started performing when I was 2 years old, and then professionally I started when I was 13 and a half years old.
It is a beautiful sight. We're happy tonight. I'm walking in a wind.
We arrived here from Sydney, Australia in 1986, and we were music entertainers.
Who's we?
My husband and I.
No pretendo ser tu dueña. No soy nada, yo no.
What do you think? All her craziness.
I love her.
Oh, look at that.
And the lighting changes.
Oh my gosh, look at this.
The energy's great, and it sure shows in her music and her stage presence, without a doubt. It's wonderful to watch, and it's very engaging as well.
Yeah, if only we could all have that kind of energy, right?
I wish I had that energy.
And I wish I could sing. Oh, no, that's way too high. I want an easy one like that.
There you go, you can do that. Perfect.
Just the way you tonight.
There you go, some amazing singing. If you have a Zoomer to nominate, don't forget to nominate them at zippyzoomer@carpe.ca.
Let's get right to today's topic. Wanda, pension protection is a CARPe priority. Why?
Carmen, it's egregious that individuals can spend decades of their lives working for a company, planning for their retirement, saving through their pension, only to hit poverty when they become a pensioner. Our members are up in arms about this and think it's time for a change.
Oh, Andrew, you agree with that?
Absolutely. In Canada, members of underfunded pension plans do face a perfect storm with a corporate environment, regulatory environment, and an insolvency environment that can work against these type of pensioners.
Charlie?
Well, there's absolutely no way in God's green earth should a person work his whole working life to retire to have his pension at risk. Part of our compensation was wages and benefits, and nobody in making a working life decision would work for a company that didn't offer a good pension plan. And to have them not fulfill the pension promise on retirement is absolutely unbelievable.
Is your pension at risk? We'll hear from retirees who will share their stories about living with pension cuts.
Still ahead on CARPe Diem.
And out of work.
This is probably about the lowest I've ever seen the mill.
My wife and I, we now have to not only the pension.
CARPe Diem, seizing the day for Canadians as we age.
In this segment, we're talking about Canadians' pensions being at risk. How is that possible? Watch these pensioners tell their story.
Well, in 2008, our company, Pope and Talbot, had declared bankruptcy, and all of a sudden our pension plan is looking at being reduced by at least 25% to 30%.
because they all remember this day. In 2008, when the bankrupt owner of the mill closed it, putting hundreds of men out of work.
My wife and I, we now have to not only the pension reduction of 30%, but the benefit package that we used to have, and that's now costing us $3,400 a year.
I'm not sure how it happened, but it sure caught me by surprise because my wife has MS and she had retired 3 or 4 years before me, and she had a pension plan that she contributed to with the employer, and it was in a separate fund, and it was locked in. And I had been retired for 5 years, and all of a sudden somebody tells me, you've lost 30% of your pension. And I'm thinking, how can I lose it?
Andrew, you're fighting for Sears employees that have lost their pensions. How did that happen?
Sears had had a struggling retail environment for many years, which was very well known to all people observing Sears. It had an underfunded pension plan. And in the years prior to its insolvency filing, which occurred in June 2017, it had paid out over $3 billion in dividends to shareholders, $3 billion. So the corporate environment permitted this type of payment. The regulatory environment did not, in our view, take sufficient steps to prevent and protect the pension.
And that's the Canadian government.
In particular, Ontario. They didn't take sufficient steps to step in to protect the pensioners before the insolvency filing. And then when the insolvency arrives, the retirees find themselves in what we call hand-to-hand combat with other creditors who are fighting over the remains of the estate. And this is not an acceptable situation for pensioners.
And this is resonating with you?
Oh, totally. They're picking up the carcass, and they're up against some pretty high-end lawyers out of representing the companies, and the pensioners are trying to afford equally in terms of legal support and finding themselves up against it in terms of having fight their battles.
Yeah. And you made a very good point at the beginning about what a pension benefit is, because this gets lost in the arguing and the debate, and even in the corporate positioning that we see. A pension benefit is a wage. It's no different from a weekly paycheck and hourly pay. It's a wage that is to be paid on retirement. And the social reason for it is well known. It's to provide an income for somebody when they're older, sicker, can no longer work. And that's the deal.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, our compensation package was wages plus benefits.
Right.
And that benefit package included a pension that also had benefits. Now, one of the things that get lost is when they take a 30% reduction, they lose all their medical benefits as well, and those costs have just continued to escalate.
And what's crazy about this is that we're seeing this at Sears. This isn't coming out of the blue. We have seen this replay itself at other organizations. We've, Hope and Talbot.
It's Groundhog's Day all over again.
Ouch.
So it's a very good point, because you're right. We do see it a lot in our practice. Why is this recurring? And it's, as I said, the three perspectives that we talk about: corporate, regulatory, and insolvency. So we see retirees now becoming more active. Your organization is doing a fantastic job with this. Not waiting around for insolvency to happen. They can see the clouds forming on the horizon early, and they take steps. And they did take steps on Sears, but wasn't enough.
And what have our political parties said on and off the campaign trail? Dean Atwell reports.
It was a high-flying, high-tech company. But in 2009, Nortel flamed out, declaring bankruptcy.
I was a Nortel pensioner. I saw my pension cut by around close to 50% when they went belly up, and sat there and watched some of the executives get huge bonuses, as Sears is doing right now.
That was Richmond resident Clyde Brown, one of 20,000 individuals whose pensions were impacted by the Nortel bankruptcy almost a decade ago.
We have been fighting in the House of Commons on the Nortel issue for months and months and months. This Conservative government may have allowed pensioners who kept that company going to be sold out. We know it's wrong. You feel it's wrong. We agree with you.
This is something that doesn't have any easy answers, but certainly we will approach supporting people with the same sense of responsibility and compassion that Canadians expect of us.
Charlie Trudeau says that it doesn't have an easy answer.
The whole point about the thing is that when we're up against it, and maybe it isn't easy, is because of the lobbyist. We're up against some very high-end lobbyists in trying to protect retirees' rights. There are banks and there are other lobbyists who are saying, you know, if you do this, it's going to discourage investment, it's going to increase interest rates, and it's going to have all these terrible impacts. But the UK and the United States don't have a problem with it. They have good pension protections there.
Such an important point. Why are Canadians second-class citizens? How is it that when a company like Nortel or Pope & Talbot or Sears goes under, the US pensioners get 100% of their pensions, and the ones in Canada take such a significant haircut?
The short answer is the regulatory regimes are a bit different. In the US, there's a company called Pension Benefits Guaranty Corporation, PBGC, which has very strong statutory powers to intervene with a company that they see is not funding its pension plan properly and its business is failing. And they did that exactly with Sears. When we tried to raise the same arguments with the Ontario regulator, we did not get a good response.
We're going to take a short break, but before that, let's hear what you have to say about companies that don't honor their commitment to employee pensions.
People who have signed on, say with Sears for that example, part of the reason that they work there, it may not be the most glamorous job, it may not be the most exciting job, but they may have done that because it pays their wages and they knew that they had a retirement. And so to pull the carpet out from under them after that's what they've counted on for all their lives is intrinsically unfair.
To me, that's right up there with bankruptcy protection. Like, those people should have been protected. Their pensions, their severance, their, you know, the health and welfare of their retirement should have been protected.
CARPe Diem. Seizing the day for Canadians as we age.
Welcome back. We're discussing Canadian pensions. How can we do a better job of protecting them? Andrew?
The solutions include, at the corporate level, restricting dividends and bonuses for companies with underfunded pension plans. At the regulatory level, passing legislation that gives our regulators more strength, number one, but number two, using the existing legislation by the regulators to intervene earlier, because it's our position they do have that ability. There's a very good example in this province, British Columbia, with respect to Catalyst very recently, where the government took a step, which we think was a great idea, to tell Catalyst that if it's planning to sell any of its business, it can no longer rely on the previous funding relief that it was enjoying, that let it pay less money to the pension plan, and would have to fund the entire deficit. And that, in our observation, changed Catalyst's behavior and led to the current deal with Paper Excellence, which is underway and not over yet, but it was a very effective move by the BC government. But that's not consistent in Canada. It's not consistent across all the provinces, and unfortunately it did not happen in Ontario.
Well, and it hasn't always happened in BC. I remember there was a softwood lumber dispute, a bit of a windfall gain. Charlie?
Yeah, that goes back to the first time the states imposed the softwood lumber tariff on the U.S. markets, but we won that case, and then the monies were repatriated back to the Canadian operations, and Pope & Talbot received $127 million in terms of money that came back. And actually the superintendent of pensions wrote to them, to the board, and said, you know what, your pension fund is probably not up to snuff to where it should be, and maybe you should consider, just consider putting a bit of money into it. I think that at the time they were maybe 20 million underfunded, and they had 127 US, which was about 140 or 50 Canadian. They could have taken that portion, funded the Pope & Talbot pension fund, but no, the money went back to the States and probably got, I'm not sure, I probably can't say this, but I will anyway, it probably got distributed to the shareholders.
Yeah. The core problem is companies are continued to allow to run a pension plan in an underfunded state. And that, I think, comes historically from a notion that you may have heard about, too big to fail. GM, Stelco, these are all Nortel, huge companies. No one would imagine that they could fail. So the regulators in the law sort of turned a blind eye to the fact that these pension plans were underfunded because the company would continue, the benefits would be paid.
I remember the Air Canada experience where Air Canada was nationally regulated, went to Jim Flaherty, who was the finance minister at the time, asking for pension relief. And he said, okay, you can have it, but you have to cut back your executive bonuses and your dividends until the pension is funded. And you know what? That pension was funded within a couple of years.
There's the incentive.
Yeah, totally.
There's the incentive. You don't want to have a legal environment for pensions that creates the wrong incentives. And right now, we do have that.
The problem is basically threefold in terms of continually to go through. The first problem, the first hurdle we have to get over are these fund managers and these hedge funds. They're sitting there and they really have no empathy whatsoever for the impact on retirees in terms of paying out dividends. The second part of the problem is the provincial government allows for the pension funds to be underfunded. The solution to that is in bankruptcy, the federal government needs to step up and say, look, the BIA, the Bankruptcy Act, and the Creditor Protection Act need to be strengthened so that if there is a bankruptcy, that there's a provision there that says when you're divvying up the corpse, pensioners need to be at the table. And presently, we're in the corridor.
Pensions earned, pensions deserved. CARPe held a National Day of Action. Here's a report from Z News in Ontario.
I worked for Sears Canada for 34 years. Mr. Trudeau in the bankruptcy laws has just made 16,000 retirees into poverty.
Over 2,000 concerned pensioners and volunteers have united all across Canada today for CARPE's National Day of Action to demand that MPs commit to better protection for pensioners.
We've reached out to all our members, and all of them together are going to be reaching out to their respective MPs to demand that pensioners be put first, be given super priority status.
I'll be 75 in May. Do I go back to work? What choices do I have?
I'm working with Minister Baines and a number of my colleagues to ensure that we do have fully funded pensions no matter what happens. We're looking at a range of policy issues and options. Super priority is one of them.
You know, I want the pressure on companies to keep the dollars in the bank and not get below.
Pensions are compensation. It's simply deferred compensation. It's not something that you earn this month. It's something that you earned over 20, 30 years.
Wanda, what was the impact of your national campaign?
Well, we heard from many MPs, cabinet ministers responding to the campaign. And when the budget came out in 2018, there was actually a line in there about pensions saying that the government would be consulted. But you know, at the time that we're filming this, we haven't heard those consultations come into action. It was, I mean, first of all, it was promise of talk, not a promise of solution, but even that talk hasn't been delivered. So I know that our members care about this. 95% of our members, when we polled them, said that the government should provide for super priority. That's one solution. We're open to others. We just don't think anybody should work their whole lives and end up taking such a haircut on their pension.
We have to take a short break. We'll be right back, but first, let's hear more about what you have to say about protecting pensions.
The government has to step in and say, this is what it was for, this is what it should be left for.
Well, it should be legislated. We have all those politicians, and they make sure they will get their pension. There is no question about that.
CARPe Diem. Seizing the day for Canadians as we age.
It's now time for our panel's final thoughts on pension protection. Charlie?
Well, you know, in terms of the pension promise, and I keep using that term and I've maybe overused it, but there is a pension promise that's out there for people who have spent their working lives, and that pension promise should be kept. As I said before, nobody would make a working life decision that would work for a corporation that didn't promise a pension fund at the end of the day. And for them to not deliver on it is if, for instance, if you cut someone's lawn for a year and he said, you know, at the end of the year, I'll pay you for cutting lawn. And you go religiously every Tuesday and cut the guy's lawn, and on December 31st, he looks at you and says, geez, Charlie, you know, I'm sorry, you don't have any money, I can't pay you. Is that right?
It's a good way to put it. So the tools are out there in the Canadian legislative and regulatory landscape. They have been used sporadically in the BC Catalyst example, in the Air Canada example. It's not a simple problem, but the tools are out there. And legally, we say, back up. Don't wait for an insolvency fight to arrive. Don't require retirees to run to lawyers like me to protect them in insolvency proceedings, as much as I'm seemingly arguing against my own practice, because that's not the right solution. The right solution is to create the right incentives at the corporate level to stop dividend payments with an underfunded plan. Don't permit a company to run an underfunded plan. Those days are over. The too big to fail, that's a different era, and it did not work out. Regulatory, from the regulatory perspective, provincial regulators need to step up and become more proactive early on, looking at what a company is doing, its performance, whether it's abusing or exploiting solvency relief that allows it to pay less into the plan and make their problem worse. Get in there, order investigations, even order a pension plan wind-up earlier, but before insolvency. We can always battle it out in insolvency. It's not the ideal solution. We have the Supreme Court of Canada case, which we think helps us. But that's a war, and that should not be happening to Canadian retirees.
I know I speak for our CARPe members who passionately believe that pensioners need to be protected in retirement. And I'm asking our viewers to also take action. Go to carpe.ca/pensions, send your MP a letter, let them know that it is not okay. People who have spent their lives working for a pension benefit need to receive that. They should not be spending their retirements in poverty.
Thank you, Charlie, for being with us. Andrew, of course, and Wanda, always a pleasure to have you on the set with us. And that's the show. Remember, as our CARPe president, Moses Neimer, always says, the best way to keep going is to keep going. So stay zippy, and Carpe Diem sees your day.